Section 14 of Volume 1 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 1 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by Francis Guizot, translated by Robert Black. Chapter 9 The Mayors of the Palace, the Pepins and the Change of Dynasty, Part 1. There is a certain amount of sound sense, of intelligent activity and practical efficiency which even the least civilized and least exacting communities absolutely must look for in their governing body. When this necessary share of ability and influence of a political kind are decidedly wanting in the men who have the titles and the official posts of power, communities seek elsewhere the qualities and their consequences which they cannot do without. The sluggard Merovingians drove the Franks, Neustrians, and Austrasians to this imperative necessity. The last of the kings sprung from Clovis acquitted themselves too ill or not at all of their task, and the mayors of the palace were naturally summoned to supply their deficiencies, and to give the populations assurance of more intelligence and energy in the exercise of power. The origin and primitive character of these supplements of royalty were different according to circumstances. At one time, conformably with their title, the mayors of the palace really came into existence in the palace of the Frankish kings, amongst the Leudes, charged, under the style of Antrusticians, lieges in the confidence of the king, intruste regia, with the internal management of the royal affairs and household, or amongst the superior chiefs of the army. At another, on the contrary, it was to resist the violence and usurpation of the kings that the Leudes, landholders or warriors, themselves chose a chief able to defend their interests and their rights against the royal tyranny or incapacity. Thus we meet, at this time, with mayors of the palace of very different political origin and intention, some appointed by the kings to support royalty against the Leudes, others chosen by the Leudes against the kings. It was especially between the Neustrian and Austrasian mayors of the palace that this difference became striking. Gallo-Roman feeling was more prevalent in Neustria, Germanic in Austrasia. The majority of the Neustrian mayors supported the interests of royalty, the Austrasian those of the aristocracy of landholders and warriors. The last years of the Merovingian line were full of their struggles, but a cause far more general and more powerful than these differences and conflicts, in the very heart of the Frankish dominions, determined the definite fall of that line and the accession of another dynasty. When in 687 the battle fought at Testri, on the banks of the Somme, left Pepin of Heristal, duke and mayor of the palace of Austrasia, victorious over Berthar, mayor of the palace of Neustria, it was a question of something very different from mere rivalry between the two Frankish dominions and their chiefs. At their entrance and settlement upon the left bank of the Rhine and in Gaul, the Franks had not abandoned the right bank in Germany. There also they remained settled and incessantly at strife with their neighbours of Germanian race, Thuringians, Bavarians, the confederation of Alemannians, Frisians, and Saxons, people frequently vanquished and subdued to all appearance, but always ready to rise either from the recovery of their independence, or again under the pressure of that grand movement which, in the 3rd century, had determined the general invasion by the barbarians of the Roman Empire. After the defeat of the Huns at Chalons, and the founding of the Visigothic, Burgundian, and Frankish kingdoms in Gaul, that movement had been, if not arrested, at any rate modified, and for the moment suspended. In the 6th century it received a fresh impulse. New nations, Avars, Tartars, Bulgarians, Slavons, and Lombards, thrust one another with mutual pressure from Asia into Europe, from Eastern Europe into Western, from the north to the south, into Italy and into Gaul. Driven by the Oighur Tartars from Pannonia and Noricum, nowadays Austria, the Lombards threw themselves first upon Italy, crossed before long the Alps, and penetrated into Burgundy and Provence, to the very gates of Avignon. On the Rhine and along the Jura the Franks had to struggle on their own account against the newcomers, and they were, further, summoned into Italy by the emperors of the East, who wanted their aid against the Lombards. Everywhere resistance to the invasion of barbarians became the national attitude of the Franks, and they proudly proclaimed themselves the defenders of that West of which they had but lately been the conquerors. When the Merovingians were indisputably nothing but sluggard kings, and when Ebroin, the last great mayor of the palace of Neustria, had been assassinated in 681, and the army of the Neustrians destroyed at the battle of Testri in 687, the ascendancy in the heart of the whole of Frankish Gaul passed to the Franks of Austrasia, already bound by their geographical position to the defence of their nation in its new settlement. There had risen up among them a family, powerful from its vast domains, from its military and political services, and already also from the prestige belonging to the hereditary transmission of name and power. Its first chief known in history had been Pepin of Landen, called the Ancient, one of the foes of Queen Brunehaut, who was so hateful to the Austrasians, and afterwards one of the privy councillors and mayor of the palace of Austrasia under Dagobert I and his son Sigebert II. He died in 639, leaving to his family an influence already extensive. His son Grimoald succeeded him as mayor of the palace, ingloriously, but his grandson, by his daughter Bega, Pepin of Heristal, was for 27 years, not only virtually, as mayor of the palace, but ostensibly and with the title of duke, the real sovereign of Austrasia and all the Frankish dominion. He did not, however, take the name of king, and four descendants of Clovis, Thierry III, Clovis III, Childebert III, and Dagobert III, continued to bear that title in Neustria and Burgundy, under the preponderating influence of Pepin of Heristal. He did, during his long sway, three things of importance. He struggled without cessation to keep or bring back under the rule of the Franks the Germanic nations on the right bank of the Rhine, Frisians, Saxons, Thuringians, Bavarians, and Alemannians, and thus to make the Frankish dominion a bulwark against the new flood of barbarians who were pressing one another westwards. He rekindled in Austrasia the national spirit and some political life by beginning again the old March parades of the Franks, which had fallen into desuetude under the last Merovingians. Lastly, and this was perhaps his most original merit, he understood of what importance for the Frankish kingdom was the conversion to Christianity of the Germanic peoples over the Rhine, and he abetted with all his might the zeal of the popes and missionaries, Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Gallo-Roman, devoted to this great work. The two apostles of Friesland, Saint Wilfrid and Saint Willibrord, especially the latter, had intimate relations with Pepin of Heristal, and received from him effectual support. More than 20 bishoprics, among others those of Utrecht, Mayence, Ratisbon, Worms, and Spire, were founded at this epoch, and one of those ardent pioneers of Christian civilization, the Irish bishop Saint Levin, martyred in 656 near Ghent, of which he has remained the patron saint, wrote in verse to his friend Herbert a little before his martyrdom: I have seen a sun without rays, days without light, and nights without repose. Around me ruggeth a people impious and clamorous for my blood. O people, what harm have I done thee? 'Tis peace that I bring thee. Wherefore declare war against me? But thy barbarism will bring my triumph, and give me the palm of martyrdom. I know in whom I trust, and my hope shall not be confounded. Whilst I am pouring forth these verses, there cometh unto me the tired driver of the ass, that beareth me the usual provisions. He bringeth that which maketh the delights of the country, even milk and butter and eggs. The cheeses stretch the wicker work of the 4 too narrow panniers. Why tarriest thou, good carrier? Quicken thy step, collect thy riches, thou that this morning art so poor. As for me, I am no longer what I was, and have lost the gift of joyous worth. How could it be otherwise, when I am witness of such cruelties? It were difficult to describe with more pious, graceful, and melancholy feeling a holier and a simpler life. After so many firm and glorious acts of authority abroad, Pepin of Heristal at his death, December 16, 714, did a deed of weakness at home. He had two wives, Plectrude and Alpaide. He had repudiated the former to espouse the latter, and the Church, considering the second marriage unlawful, had constantly urged him to take back Plectrude. He had by her a son, Grimoald, who was assassinated on his way to join his father lying ill near Liege. This son left a child, Theodobald, only 6 years old. This child it was whom Pepin, either from a grandfather's blind fondness, or through the influence of his wife Plectrude, appointed to succeed him, to the detriment of his two sons by Alpaide, Charles and Hildebrand. Charles, at that time 25 years of age, had already a name for capacity and valour. On the death of Pepin, his widow Plectrude lost no time in arresting and imprisoning at Cologne this son of her rival Alpaide; but some months afterwards, in 715, the Austrasians, having risen against Plectrude, took Charles out of prison and set him at their head, proclaiming him Duke of Austrasia. He was destined to become Charles Martel. He first of all took care to extend and secure his own authority over all the Franks. At the death of Pepin of Heristal, the Neustrians, vexed at the long domination of the Austrasians, had taken one for themselves, Ragenfrid, as mayor of the palace, and had placed at his side a Merovingian sluggard king, Chilperic II., whom they had dragged from a monastery. Charles, at the head of the Austrasians, twice succeeded in beating, first near Cambrai and then near Soissons, the Neustrian king and mayor of the palace, pursued them to Paris, returned to Cologne, got himself accepted by his old enemy Queen Plectrude, and remaining temperate amidst the triumph of his ambition, he too took from amongst the surviving Merovingians a sluggard king, whom he installed under the name of Clotaire IV., himself becoming, with the simple title of Duke of Austrasia, master of the Frankish dominion. Being in tranquillity on the left bank of the Rhine, Charles directed towards the right bank, towards the Frisians and the Saxons, his attention and his efforts. After having experienced, in a first encounter, a somewhat severe check, he took, from 715 to 718, ample revenge upon them, repressed their attempts at invasion of Frankish territory, and pursued them on their own, imposed tribute upon them, and commenced with vigor against the Saxons in particular that struggle, at first defensive and afterwards aggressive, which was to hold so prominent a place in the life and glorious but blood-stained annals of his grandson Charlemagne. In the war against the Neustrians, at the battle of Soissons in 719, Charles had encountered in their ranks Eudes, or Eudes, Duke of Aquitania and Vasconia, that beautiful portion of southern Gaul situated between the Pyrenees, the ocean, the Garonne, and the Rhone, who had been for a long time trying to shake off the dominion of the barbarians, Visigoths, or Franks. At the death of Pepin of Heristal, the Neustrians had drawn into alliance with them for their war against the Austrasians, this Duke Elides, to whom they gave, as it appears, the title of king. After their common defeat at Soissons, the Aquitan prince withdrew precipitately into his own country, taking with him the sluggard king of the Neustrians, Chilperic II. Charles pursued him to the Loire, and sent word to him, a few months afterwards, that he would enter into friendship with him if he would deliver up Chilperic and his treasures; otherwise he would invade and ravage Aquitania. Eudes delivered up Chilperic and his treasures, and Charles, satisfied with having in his power this Merovingian phantom, treated him generously, kept up his royal rank, and at his death, which happened soon afterwards, replaced him by another phantom of the same line, Theodoric or Thierry IV., whom he dragged from the abbey of Chelles, founded by Queen Saint Bathilde, wife of Clovis II., and who for 17 years bore the title of king, whilst Charles Martel was ruling gloriously, and was perhaps the savior of the Frankish dominions. When he contracted the alliance with the Duke of Aquitania, Charles Martel did not know against what enemies and perils he would soon have to struggle. In the earlier years of the 8th century, less than 100 years from the death of Mahomet, the Mussulman Arabs, after having conquered Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and northern Africa, had passed into Europe, invaded Spain, overthrown the kingdom of the Visigoths, driven back the remnants of the nation and their chief, Pelagius, to the north of the peninsula, into the Asturias and Galicia, and pushed even beyond the Pyrenees, into old Narbonness, then called Septimania, their limitless incursions. These fiery conquerors did not amount at that time, according to the most probable estimates, to more than 50,000, but they were under the influence of religious and warlike enthusiasm at one and the same time. They were fanatics in the cause of deism and of glory. The Arab warrior during campaigns was not excused from any one of the essential duties of Islamism. He was bound to pray at least once a day, on rising in the morning at the blush of dawn. The general of the army was its priest. He it was who, at the head of the ranks, gave the signal for prayer, uttered the words, reminded the troops of the precepts of the Koran, and enjoined upon them forgetfulness of personal quarrels. One day, on the point of engaging in a decisive battle, Moussa ben Noissar, first governor of Mussulman Africa, was praying, according to usage, at the head of the troops, and he omitted the invocation of the name of the Caliph, a respectful formality indispensable on the occasion. One of his officers, persuaded that it was a mere slip on Moussa's part, made a point of admonishing him. Know thou, said Moussa, that we are in such a position, and at such an hour, that no other name must be invoked save that of the Most High God. Moussa was apparently the first Arab chief to cross the Pyrenees and march, plundering as he went, into Narbonness. The Arabs had but very confused ideas of Gaul; they called it Franjas, and gave to all its inhabitants, without distinction, the name of Franch. The Caliph Abdelmelek, having recalled Moussa, questioned him about the different peoples with which he had been concerned. And of these Franch, said he, what hast thou to tell me? They are a people, answered Moussa, very many in number and abundantly provided with everything, brave and impetuous in attack, but spiritless and timid under adverses. And how went the war betwixt them and thee? Added Abdelmelek. Was it favourable to thee or the contrary? The contrary. Nay, by Allah and the Prophet, never was my army vanquished, never was a battalion beaten, and never did the Mussulmans hesitate to follow me when I led them 40 against 80. In 719, under El Idaur ben Abdel Rahman, a valiant and able leader, say the Arab writers, but greedy, harsh, and cruel, the Arabs pursued their incursions into southern Gaul, took Narbonne, dispersed the inhabitants, spread themselves abroad in search of plunder as far as the borders of the Garonne, and went and laid siege to Toulouse. Eudes, Duke of Aquitania, happened to be at Bordeaux, and he hastily summoned all the forces of his towns and all the populations from the Pyrenees to the Loire, and hurried to the relief of his capital. The Arabs, commanded by a new chieftain, El Samah, more popular amongst them than El Haur, awaited him beneath the walls of the city, determined to give him battle. Have ye no fear of this multitude? Said El Samah to his warriors. If God be with us, who shall be against us? Elides had taken equally great pains to kindle the pious courage of the Aquitanians. He spread amongst his troops a rumour that he had but lately received as a present from Pope Gregory II 3 sponges that had served to wipe down the table at which the sovereign pontiffs were accustomed to celebrate the communion. He had them cut into little strips, which he had distributed to all those of the combatants who wished for them, and thereupon gave the sword to sound the charge. The victory of the Aquitanians was complete. The Arab army was cut in pieces. El Samah was slain, and with him, according to the victors' accounts, full 375,000 of his troops. The most truth-like testimonies and calculations do not put down at more than from 50 to 70,000 men in fighting trim, the number of Arabs that entered Spain 8 or 10 years previously, even with the additions it must have received by means of the emigration from Africa, and undoubtedly El Samah could not have led into Aquitania more than from 40 to 45,000. However that may be, the defeat of the Arabs before Toulouse was so serious that 4 or 5 centuries afterwards Ibn Hayyan, the best of their historians, still spoke of it as the object of solemn commemoration, and affirmed that the Arab army had entirely perished there, without the escape of a single man. The spot in the Roman road between Carcassonne and Toulouse, where the battle was fought, was one heap of dead bodies, and continued to be mentioned in the Arab chronicles under the name of Martyrs' Causeway. But the Arabs of Spain were then in that unstable social condition, and in that heyday of impulsive youthfulness as a people, when men are more apt to be excited and attracted by the prospect of bold adventures than discouraged by reverses. El Samah, on crossing the Pyrenees to go plundering and conquering in the country of the French, had left as his lieutenant in the Iberian Peninsula Anbessa ben Sohim, one of the most able, most pious, most just, and most humane chieftains, say the Arabic chronicles, that Islamism ever produced in Europe. He, being informed of El Samah's death before Toulouse, resolved to resume his enterprise and avenge his defeat. In 725 he entered Gaul with a strong army, took Carcassonne, reduced, either by force or by treaty, the principal towns of Septimania to submission, and even carried the Arab arms, for the first time, beyond the Rhone into Provence. At the news of this fresh invasion, Duke Eudes hurried from Aquitania, collecting on his march the forces of the country, and, after having waited some time for a favourable opportunity, gave the Arabs battle in Provence. It was indecisive at first, but ultimately won by the Christians without other result than the retreat of Anbessa, mortally wounded, upon the right bank of the Rhone, where he died without having been able himself to recross the Pyrenees, but leaving the Arabs masters of Septimania, where they established themselves in force, taking Narbonne for capital and a starting point for their future enterprises. End of chapter 9, part 1.